Hi everyone, and thank you for watching another episode of Gaffer and Gear. In today's episode, we're going to be taking a look at the new and improved Forza 300 Mark II range. We have the monocolor version here, and we've got the bicolor version here. The monocolor light here is using 3 emitters. So it has your daylight with green and magenta hue adjustment. Now the bicolor light has a CCT range from 2700 Kelvin up to 6500 Kelvin. With magenta and green correction. The light tracks to the Planckian curve, it has incredible CCT accuracy, and it does all this while still maintaining a minimum TM30 color render score of 94. We'll also be having a look at how these lights perform with their supplied reflectors, the Fresnel, and the projection attachment. Now the big feature with these is the green magenta correction. So let's talk about how this works. And we'll start off with the daylight light only. So essentially it's got its white color emitters. In addition to this, you have rows of red emitters, which then dial up to give you your magenta correction. And you have rows of green emitters, which dial up to give you your plus green correction. So this is the spectrum distribution with the light running with no correction. This is with full plus green correction. And this is with full magenta correction. Now I've got to admit, the bicolor has got me stumped a little bit. It's got a frosted front, so I can't see what the LEDs are doing, but maybe it is as simple as warm white, cool white, green and red emitters working all together, but whatever they're doing, they've done a very clever job of compressing everything together and delivering the output. So can these lights give you the same amount of plus minus green magenta correction that you can get out of a fully fledged RGB WW light? Well, the answer is no. You only get about half of the correction. So if you've got a fully calibrated RGB WW light that has green and magenta correction, it's usually scaled from 0 to 100, with 100 being the equivalent of a full correction gel and 50 being the equivalent of a half correction gel. Now these only get you the equivalent correction to just under a half correction gel. Now on the screen with these, the scaling goes from 0 to 80. So if you're adding plus green, it goes up to plus 80. And if you're doing minus green or adding magenta, it goes to minus 80. So using my spectrometer, I tried to figure out what scale this is working to. And much to my surprise, it's actually measuring delta UV. So plus 80 is the equivalent to plus 0.0080 delta UV, and minus 80 is the equivalent to minus 0.0080 delta UV. Now for me, this makes a huge amount of sense because you can select delta UV as an option on your color spectrometers. Now what I have found through using this is the scaling system on the lights is typically accurate to plus or minus 3 to 5 delta UV increments. Now, if you're somebody who uses gels, let me explain to you just how accurate that is. That means that if you take a reading on your spectrometer and then dial this into match using the DUV increments, you will be accurate to the white point that you wanted by around 1/5 of a 1/8 correction gel. All right, so let's go through a quick list of pros and cons, and I don't have much to say in the way of cons because this is a version 2. They made all of their mistakes on version 1, and geez, they had a lot of mistakes. The list would be about as long as my arm, but they've sorted all that out. Now, I only have a few things as negatives. So number 1 is the head lead hits the stirrup. So that's a little bit irritating. That's something that could have been simply avoided. Now, the head leads are better built, but here's my next issue. They're only 3 meters long. So I've got this incredibly lightweight compact unit that really lends itself towards rigging or putting on a boom arm or putting on a menace arm, and I'm restricted by a 3-meter head lead. The next negative is the power cable. It's actually made from cheap domestic PVC. So the problem for me here in Australia is that, maybe this doesn't wind up into a nice circle, but if you live somewhere else in the world where it gets freezing cold in winter, this will freeze into a solid circle. The overwhelming pro with the version 2s is, compared to the version 1s, these really are professional in terms of their build quality. Let's be honest here. Version 1 was never intended as a professional light. They were intended for the prosumer market. And people like me, professional gaffers, the only reason we bought them is because we looked at the Forza 500s and went, wow, they're really bright. They're a HMI replacement. Those Forza 500s, they replaced my 200 watt, 400 watt, 575s, 800 and my 1.2K HMIs. And okay, they had some prosumer issues, like the lock-offs were shit, the connectors were terrible, but those negatives compared to the negatives of running all of my HMI lights and maintaining all my HMI stock, it was a no-brainer to do the switchover. But these lights are really professionally built compared to the version 1s. The only difference between these and say something that I would consider to be totally professional is these don't have a weather protection rating or built-in CRMX. If they had those two things, these would be, in my opinion, a top-end professional light. Now, I think the build quality of these is easily going to be able to cope with the conditions that we work in as professional users. Now, in terms of other pros, the DMX is amazing. Once you get past the very bad default settings that it has in the menu, once you turn the smoothing on, the DMX is absolutely awesome. Beautiful fade ups, beautiful fade downs, beautiful transitions, and very responsive. The last pro is if you're using the phone app, these things are fully compatible with the phone app. All right, so let's go through how much these cost and what you get for your money. So I'm only going to give US prices because the Australian prices are all over the place. The variation from one seller to another is absolutely ridiculous. All right, so we've got the 300 here, the monocolor or the daylight only. That sells for about 950 US dollars. And the bicolor sells for 1,000 US dollars. So there's only a $50 price difference. Now, in terms of the brightness, the monocolor only comes in at 17% brighter with some of the modifiers. So I don't really know if it's worth saving that 50 US bucks to forego the bicolor. All right, so let's go through what you get in the kits. So the kits come with a bag, of course. Now, they've dramatically improved the bags. The sidewalls have been reinforced and they've reinforced the stitching here. So a huge improvement on the bags. They've still got these top Velcro elastic bits for putting your stands through. These are still going to rip off though. So look, when I buy one of their products, I just remove that from the bag. All right, let's get that around the correct way so I can get inside it. Okay, first thing you get in the bag is your instruction manuals. Always worth having a read of these things. Okay, next thing we'll have a look at is the light itself. Now you get a cap, protective cap. Now one of the differences between these and the original Series 1 is there's a glass protector on the front. Now with the bicolor version, that glass protector is also a mixing screen, so it's got a bit of diffusion on it. The other improvements you have is you've got an umbrella mount on the side here. You've got a ratchet handle lock-off, which is on the single side, and it locks off securely. It also has a lot more angle of adjustment. It doesn't have those Rosetta teeth systems. So huge improvement there on the lock-off. And it's got a tilted stirrup, so you can get a point further down with your modifiers. Now this is very, very lightweight. All right, next thing we'll have a look at is the controllers. All right, so big difference between this and version 1 is the V-mounts go on the sides here. So you can run this off a single V-mount battery or you can run it off 2 V-mount batteries. Now you can only run it off 14.8 volt V-mounts. All your connectors are in the top. You've got your DMX in and out, which is 5-pin XLR. The other improvement is it's got a power con connector. Okay, so it's not using a jug plug or an IEC lead, which easily disconnects. And you've got a really good terminal here for connecting your head lead. Now, the other improvement is this is a gigantic heatsink metal housing. So it doesn't have a cooling fan. Okay, so that's a huge improvement in the design. Next thing is your clamp that mounts the controller to the stand, and what a huge improvement this thing is. Okay, so it's got a simple V-mount style connector on the back. There you go, that's not going to come loose. All right, let's continue through. You get a head lead, which is only 3 meters. It's got good connectors on it. So the connectors on the previous series, they were rubbish and very easy for people to connect the wrong way around. The only sort of issue I got with these is they don't interconnect, so you can't just buy 2 of them to extend your distance. And the last thing you get is, not the last thing, you get your power cable with your original plug and Nutrix connector. And the last thing you get is the dish, which is a faceted dish for maximizing your output. Okay, so let's have a look at how these lights perform with and without their different modifiers. And let's start off with the daylight unit only. Now, if you want more detail on some of these modifiers, I've done previous episodes, so take a look at those. All right, let's start off with the 300 daylight with no modifier attached. As you would expect, this has a broad, even beam that could easily light up a large area or a large dome or a large lantern. Now, even with full green dialed in, the characteristics are the same. And there's no noticeable change in the characteristics of the light with full magenta dialed in. And as you'd expect from a small point source like this, it has very crisp shadows. Now let's take a look at the 300-watt daylight with the supplied reflector. For a faceted dish, it has a very even beam with hardly any hotspot and a nice gentle drop off. But it has some very distinctive double shadowing. Now let's take a look at the 300 daylight with the Forza Fresnel. It has a very even beam spread. And it barn door cuts very nicely. And the flood spot is very impressive. And the shadow qualities are what I would expect from a good Fresnel of this size. Now let's have a look at the 300 daylight with the Forza projection attachment. This has a very even beam. Now it does do very good cuts, but they're not as sharp as with the bicolor, which we'll get to in a sec. Now if you dial in full plus green or full plus magenta and defocus it, you have to defocus a long way before you see the stripe pattern in the emitters, which gives this combination a lot of practical use. Gobo patterns have a lot of range for defocusing. Now here I'm using a more organic pattern with defocusing with the light set to full magenta correction, just to see if there's any problem with defocusing and seeing the color emitters. Now let's take a look at how the bicolor unit performs with and without the different modifiers. Now let's take a look at the 300B with no modifiers attached. And as you would expect, it has a massive even spread. Now right on the edge of the drop off, there is a little bit of green hue to roughly the equivalent of a 1/8 correction gel. But this wouldn't put me off using the light. The results are the same regardless of the CCT that you dial in. And the shadows are extremely crisp. Now let's take a look at the 300B with the supplied reflector. It has a nice even beam with minimal hotspot. The results are the same regardless of the CCT that you dial in. And like most faceted dishes, it has double shadowing. Now let's take a look at the 300B with the Forza Fresnel. It has a nice even beam with some soft drop off. Regardless of the CCT dialed in, the results are the same. It barn door cuts nicely, but it doesn't seem to be as sharp to me as the monocolor light was. And it's got a good spot. And the shadows, well, they're as good as you get off any good Fresnel. And just as a side note, these are the spectrometer readings through the Fresnel set to 5600 Kelvin. Now let's take a look at the 300B through the nanlight projection attachment. It gives you a beautiful even beam. Regardless of the CCT that you dial in. The blade cuts are extremely sharp. And you have the full range of focus and defocus with this combination. Gobo projections are also sharp, regardless of the CCT that you dial in. And even with full magenta correction, you don't see any color emitters when you defocus. Here's a more random pattern, and the results are the same regardless of the CCT that you dial in. And you have the full range of focus and defocus. Now, if you've watched my review of this projector mount, you know it has a slight green hue, but that was extremely easy to dial out using the DUV reading on my spectrometer. Alright, so let's talk about the DMX capabilities of these lights. Now, they don't have CRMX or WDMX, they only run off 5-pin XLR, and that's fair enough for the price point. Now, the DMX capabilities of these lights is awesome. For the price, you're going to be completely blown away. These perform in their DMX as good as really expensive lights that I own. But here's the catch. You won't know that if you're running it off the factory defaults. The factory defaults are actually terrible and give you the worst DMX experience that you can get. So go into the menu system and have a play around. You'll be quite surprised at the DMX options that you have there. It's actually a very mature DMX system. Anyway, take a close note of the DMX settings that I've got and let's have a look at how the light performs. I have the 300 Mark II daylight only, running off an 8-bit 2-channel reduced profile. It has its smoothing turned on, the dimmer curve is set to linear, and it is receiving its commands via an external lumen radio receiver. Next to that I have the 300B Mark II, which is running off an 8-bit 3-channel reduced profile. It has its DMX smoothing turned on. It is running off a linear dimmer curve with its output mode set to constant brightness. And it is receiving its commands via an external lumen radio receiver. To give you something to compare the response times to, I have an Astera tube which is running off an 8-bit profile, and it is also receiving its commands via CRMX. All three lights will be receiving their commands at the same time. Let's start off with instant on-off commands. Now let's do some half-second cues. Now let's take a look at some 1-second cues. Now let's take a look at some 2.5-second cues. Now let's take a look at some 5-second cues. Now let's have a look at some CCT crossovers. Now, because the Forza 300 Mark II daylight only version is not bicolor capable, that won't be joining in for the testing. Let's start off with some instant CCT changeovers between 3200 and 5600 Kelvin. Now let's have a look at some half-second changeovers. Now for some 1-second changeovers. Now for some 2.5-second changeovers. And now for some 5-second changeovers. Now let's have a look at some random commands dialed in manually. Now let's take a look at the user interface. Now just a reminder that this episode is chaptered, so if you're not interested in this section, you can skip to the next chapter. Let's start off with the Forza 300 daylight unit first, and this is really simple to operate. If you want to adjust your brightness, that's the knob on the left, and it adjusts in 1% increments. If you want to adjust your plus minus green magenta values, that's the knob on the right. If you want to reset your plus minus green magenta values to 0, just press the button. You can toggle between 0 brightness and the brightness you've got dialed in by just pressing the button on the left. Now let's have a look at the layout on the 300B, and the interface is a little bit different. The knob on the right selects your parameter, and the left knob selects your value. If you press the left knob, it can go between presets. So on your brightness, you've got the value that you've dialed in, and you can quickly use this as an on-off. When your CCT is selected, you can adjust your CCT in 100 Kelvin increments. If you press the blue button, it'll jump to presets. And your green is selectable in 1 delta UV increments. If you want to turn off your plus minus green or reset it back to 0, just press the button. The next button across is your effects mode. So you can toggle between your effects mode by pressing the effects button or the CCT button. Again, your right button selects your parameters, and the left knob is your value that you input. Next across is the menu button. To go up and down in the menu, use the right knob. To make your selection, press the right knob. To go back, hit the menu button. Now let's have a look at output mode. This selects whether you've got maximum output or constant output. So if you've got constant output selected, the light stays the same brightness regardless of your CCT that you dial in. Next thing is your DMX menu. First up is your DMX address. That's pretty straightforward. Next is your DMX mode. So you've got a choice of two profiles here, 8-bit CCT and Ultimate DMX 8-bit. Ultimate DMX gives you access to your effects. Next thing is reduced channel modes. You've got a choice here of on or off. What this does is take fan control out of the DMX, reducing your DMX profiles by one channel. Next is your DMX dimmer curve. And DMX smoothing is the last thing in this menu. I would definitely have this switched to on. To go back in the menu, press menu again to exit the submenu. Next is your wireless control. That's for your phone app, I won't get into that. Next is your fan control. You've got a choice of smart, full speed, low and off. If you select low, it'll tell you on the display what your output is now limited to. If you select off, your output is further limited, and this is explained to you on the display. Next in the main menu, you can rotate your screen, you can select your screen brightness, and you can select button backlight. I'd recommend having your button backlight turned on. The buttons illuminate in the dark, and you can actually read what it says underneath the button. Next down in your menu is your language selection, followed by your firmware update options and your version information. All right, let's have a look at all the data I've collected for the daylight only version. The maximum power draw recorded was 340.3 watt. At 100% brightness, I was recording 339.3 watt. Here are the readings at 100%, 50%, 10% and 5% brightness. As you can see, there is minimal shift in the CCT, minimal shift in the color render results, and the total difference in the white point between 100% and 5% is the equivalent to less than 1/2 of a 1/8 correction gel. At 100% brightness, I got 5,563 Kelvin with an SSI score of 74. The TM30 color render results were 95% average color accuracy with an average 102% color saturation. These are the CRI results, and only R12 is below 90. Here is the spectrum distribution, and the white point came in with a delta UV of plus 0.0012, which puts the light slightly above the Planckian curve, but below the daylight curve. Set to 5% brightness, I got 5,635 Kelvin with an SSI of 72. The TM30 color render results were 94% average color accuracy with an average 102% color saturation. With the CRI scores, R9 and R12 were below 90. Here is the spectrum distribution, and the white point came in almost on the Planckian curve with a delta UV of plus 0.0001, which would make the light slightly magenta when compared to the daylight curve by about the equivalent of a 1/8 correction gel. Now let's have a look at all the data I've collected on the bicolor light. The maximum power draw recorded over several days of testing was 351.7 watt. At 3200 Kelvin, I was metering 329.9 watt, and at 5600 Kelvin, I was metering 326.4 watt. This light's CCT target values were incredibly accurate. Between 2700 to 4000 Kelvin, it was out by an average of plus or minus 19 Kelvin. Between 4100 Kelvin to 5000 Kelvin, it was typically out by plus 56 Kelvin. Between 5100 Kelvin to 6000 Kelvin, it was typically out by plus or minus 17 Kelvin. And between 6100 Kelvin to 6500 Kelvin, it was out by an average of plus or minus 24. Here are the color render results measured in TM30 RF. Between 2700 Kelvin to 3300 Kelvin, it scored 95. Between 3400 to 4600 Kelvin, it scored 94. Between 4700 to 5300 Kelvin, it scored 95. And from 5400 Kelvin up, it scored 94. Here is the white point accuracy measured in delta UV. Between 2700 Kelvin to 4000 Kelvin, it is incredibly accurate with an average of plus or minus 0.0004. Between 4100 to 5000 Kelvin, it is tracking the Planckian curve to an amazing accuracy of plus 0.0005. Between 5100 to 6000 Kelvin, it has an average of 0.0013, and from 6100 Kelvin up, it is averaging plus 0.0012. Here are the results for the light running at 3200 Kelvin at 100%, 50%, 10%, and 5% brightness. As you can see, there is minimal shift in the CCT. The color render also stays very consistent. However, it does shift slightly towards a green hue at 10 and 5%, but this is well under the equivalent of a 1/8 correction gel. And here are the results with dimming at 5600 Kelvin. The CCT is again very consistent. The TM30 RF color render scores don't move. And once again, the light does slightly shift towards green as it is dimmed. The difference between 100% brightness and 5% brightness, though, is less than the equivalent of a 1/8 correction gel. Now let's take a closer look at some of our kelvins, starting off with the lowest kelvin that we can dial in. And all of these readings are taken with no modifier attached. When I dialed in 2700 Kelvin, I got 2709. The TM30 color render results were 95% average color accuracy with an average 101% color saturation. All of the CRI scores are plus 90. Here is the spectrum distribution. And the white point came in with a delta UV of minus 0.0005. At 3200 Kelvin, I got 3221 with an SSI score of 85. The TM30 color render testing came in with a 95% average color accuracy with an average 102% color saturation. Here are the CRI scores. R11 and R12 are below 90. This is the spectrum distribution. And the white point came in with a delta UV of minus 0.0003, which makes the white point very accurate to that of a tungsten light. When I dialed in 4400 Kelvin, I got 4464. The TM30 color render results were 94% average color accuracy with an average 103% color saturation. Here are the CRI scores. R9, R11 and R12 are all below 90. Here is a spectrum distribution, and you can clearly see the caps of the three emitters. And the white point came in with a delta UV of plus 0.0007, which means the light is tracking very close to the Planckian curve. When I dialed in 5600 Kelvin, I got a very accurate 5613 with an SSI score of 73. The TM30 color render results were 94% average color accuracy with an average 103% color saturation. Here are the CRI scores. R9 and R12 are below 90. Here is a spectrum distribution. And the white point came in with a delta UV of plus 0.0011, which gives the light a slight green hue of about half of a 1/8 correction if you're comparing it to the Planckian curve, but would make the light slightly magenta by less than a 1/8 correction gel if you're comparing it to the daylight curve. When I dialed in the maximum Kelvin of 6500, I got 6455. The TM30 color render results were 94% average color accuracy with an average 102% color saturation. With the CRI scores, only R12 is below 90. Here is a spectrum distribution. And the white point came in with a delta UV of plus 0.0012. I can't believe how much has changed in the last year, because a year ago, I thought bicolor was actually dead and buried because I was buying the brightest monocolor light I could get, using that usually as sunlight, and then everything else was an RGB option, so I had all of that color choice. But in the last year, I've been selling off so many monocolor lights because, you know, bicolor lights now have so much firepower. The technology's come a long way. And the advantage I see with this is that hue adjustment. That means that our bicolor lights can tie in with our RGB lights. So if you're dialing in a middle Kelvin like 4000 Kelvin, you know, your bicolor lights are no longer going to be that magenta that stands out on set. Anyway, the technology ball just keeps on rolling, doesn't it? See you on the next episode of Gaffer and Gear.